Hi, good morning here. No, good morning there, I think. It's afternoon here, but thanks for joining us today. I wanted just to say a couple of words about the title we have here and to go through the agenda. Health and safety is very often in the news, and it's not always for the right reasons, is it? You get headlines like "Health and Safety Gone Mad" in the UK, and should trapeze artists wear hat is another one that's quite often quoted. So there's a lot of discussion around health and safety and where it's going for that reason, and for others as well, which we're going to discuss during this webinar. The questions are: what are the motives for health and safety? Is it driven by fear or pedantry or a need for someone to take the blame? And so this is an ongoing discussion. It's in everybody's face in the UK, certainly through the popular press. In terms of who we are, PCL has been established now for nearly a quarter of a century. We would describe ourselves as innovative, and by that I'm referring to innovative in the application of applied psychology and finding solutions that are actually based on that science. We are research oriented, both in terms of our consultancy, so our approach to working with organizations is data driven really, but also in the development of assessment products. And the global influence we have is through our online systems, our web services, our global clients, and our network of distributors. Okay, so this we've chosen as a starting point. This is something that we will often hear in the course of our consultancy work, a quote from Tom Harvey. We have good processes. If we could just get people to follow them, we would be fine. There's something about that that's slightly complacent, maybe, in the sense that we've done all our bit, now it's somebody else's turn. It's not us, it's somebody else. It's a bit shoulder shrugging. And I wonder if we've arrived at this situation because the early success with health and safety, which was absolutely dramatic in industry all over the world, and the investment that encouraged in terms of the development of health and safety schemes and methods and strategies, have tightened the grip on health and safety in a way which is now in some places becoming somewhat counterproductive. That's a point to debate. The pursuit of zero incident goals puts the pressure on. What we know too is that we have, or seem to have achieved, a sort of plateau in a way. The dramatic advances and benefits that we've seen in all the industries in terms of health and safety seem now to have slowed down, and we're having difficulty in getting rid of that last difficult part of the problem, or the problems of health and safety. Here are some quotes from an industry-wide survey by DuPont, or commissioned by DuPont, as struggling to maintain consistency safety levels across a large multinational organization. 50% endorsed that item. And the ability to keep safety at work fresh, inspiring and interesting, 25% see that as a problem. And the ability to influence shop floor behavior, again, 25% endorse that. So what is the answer? I mean, do we need more? Do we need less? Do we need to do things that are different than in the past? There's a realization amongst regulators, in the UK especially, and I'm not sure whether that's the same thing in the States, but may well be. But the safety objectives can never be fully realized through rule enforcement alone. It'll only take you so far. So forced workplace discipline can be counterproductive. The problem is when it's you will do this and do it the way that we say, you inevitably begin to generate a them and us kind of mentality. And because of the nature of human beings, not everybody's as compliant as that, and some people will kick against it or push back on some of those instructions or find reasons for complaint with it. And you can get a situation that is characterized by mistrust and resentment and the disaffection of staff. And we come across this on a regular basis. We're not talking about the whole organization being that light. It doesn't take the whole organization to have that mentality for it to be an issue. And it is an issue in many cases in the industries that we've worked in. And it's something that needs to be considered and addressed. Trust and mutual respect are what we're looking to achieve, and we have to do that through a proper consideration of the human factors. So that brings that into my territory, if you like. That brings it into the psychology realm. We've found these common themes then. Staff that are irritated and frustrated. You find situations where people have been doing their job for the last 25 years, are very capable, very knowledgeable about it, but because of the structure of the organization, a rather comparatively young, wet behind the ears manager comes along with a clipboard and says, this is how you should do that job, and that causes not only irritation and frustration of that individual, but also the people who are less experienced and who look up to that person. So you can see in that kind of scenario the seeds of some discontent. You get complaints about the stress and time pressure of doing jobs because the job analysis or the risk analysis may require a very detailed approach which takes care of every possible eventuality, and that's of course very different from the way people are used to working. In their own DIY life at home, they'll do things in a way that they are very confident that they can do without any problem. But in a work context, they're having to do similar things, but in a different kind of a way. And this all begins to erode then, well, not for everybody. I mean, some people, that's exactly as they would like it. Let's be clear about that. The workforce isn't all anti. There are plenty of people in the workforce who look for that kind of guidance and expect management to provide it. But for others, it's a matter of its impact on job satisfaction and their engagement. Communication is an issue very often too, in that new diktats are passed down from on high without any explanation. This is how we're doing things from now on. And all of that, that doesn't help relationships either. Particularly, I mean, what we're trying to do is to get people on the side. These are all ways which, maybe to a smaller extent, maybe to a larger extent, are going to make inroads into the commitment of the people that we need to be committed. You have on the right-hand side now then the dangers of developing a them and us mentality. Responsibility falls, when things go wrong, responsibility falls to the people on the shop floor. You get disengagement over time, and that's something obviously that within the culture of the organization festers if it's not addressed, and you get decreased motivation and engagement. I mean, some of the companies that we work with have given up on all of that. I mean, they see that as not anything to do with us, it's to do with the workforce, and we know what we want, and if they can't deliver, then there's a problem. And let me also add at this point that no one's suggesting that the objectives should be anything other than they are. You do want zero risks, you do want limited accidents, you do want lots of good health and safety procedures. It's just a matter of what should those procedures actually be. So again, from the DuPont survey, these were some of the ideas that are now becoming very current, the solutions based on the psychology of safety, if you like, but really focusing on proactive behaviors, on wanting people to take the initiative themselves, not to simply be slave to a checklist. New behavioral safety models that encourage people to improve their workplace performance. See, I mean, as soon as you talk about encouragement, you can see that if you've got a disengaged workforce, that's very hard to achieve. and certainly as an external consultant, it's very hard to get the engagement of people. It can take a lot of work to get people on side, to get into a position where they're prepared to work with you. And you want more of a focus on safety leadership rather than saying, look, it's all your responsibility. If you don't do it by the checklist, it's your fault. So what do we mean by the human factors perspective? Because this is the other side of the equation, really. By and large, health and safety is focused on procedures and processes. It's been a top-down sort of process. And there's been a neglect of human factors. I mean, I think generally in risk management, there are a lot of other management strategies that have been adopted, things like lean and agile and so on, and Six Sigma. That kind of approach is fine and is beneficial, but it doesn't get down to individuals. It treats people rather than as individuals. So this is a quote at the top of the page there, comes from a health and safety executive, very recent publication. And you can see that in their thinking, personality is beginning to have an impact. So you should be included in competence, skills, personality, attitude, risk perception. Those are the sort of elements they're focusing on. Individual characteristics that influence behavior in complex ways. Some of these characteristics of personality are fixed, they recognize. And I think generally within psychology, personality psychology today, we would say that over a working lifetime, personality is fixed. It doesn't mean, well, I'll go more into, I'll qualify that later on. But we can see where they're coming from. There are aspects of people's personality which in fact determine whether they love to do it by the book or whether they're going to challenge and resist things. So these things are there. They need to be considered. They're not going to go away. So in our analysis then, human factors is about self-knowledge. Self-knowledge is absolutely crucial. And when I say self-knowledge, that's about understanding yourself and something about your behavior, something about your own personality, insofar as it impacts on the job that you're doing. And that's attainable. And secondly, we want them to get into a position where they are taking personal responsibility for their behavior. It's like the old adage that one volunteer is worth 10 pressed men, I think they used to say. And so taking personal responsibility is great. If someone is doing that, then they're doing saving a whole lot of work and misplaced effort in trying to regulate and drive them in that direction. So you're looking then on the final column here about people being self-regulating. In teams, being aware, if people have self-knowledge and they're prepared to share that, which is about the bottom point really, it's about having open communication about these things, then you can develop a team culture where people appreciate the strengths and weaknesses of each person in the team. Very much as in a football match, you've got to have, well, should we say soccer? No, let's say football. You need people who are going to score the goals. You need people who are going to defend well. You need people who are going to run, fight. You know, the different roles on any team sport. And this is what we're talking about, recognizing that some people are better at some things than others. And that's the reality. You may kind of brush over it, but it's a fact. And it's about enabling people to contribute because of that, contributing from their strengths, being aware of what their blind spots are. And then there's, from the personal responsibility, it's a culture of mutual respect rather than mistrust. It's a culture where people have job satisfaction and engagement, and as we've said, the communication is open and honest. There's some behavioural safety quotes. I mean, the term behavioural safety seems to have a lot of different meanings, and I think it's only recently been coined by the regulators in the UK, certainly. But I think what we're talking about is that people take care of their own behaviour, and so that's the issue. It's what happens on the ground. What do people actually do? Why do they do it? So focusing on behavioural safety rather than non-compliance reporting can be an effective way of engaging staff. And that's the point we've really already made, I think. Secondly, engage people on a personal level so they do the right thing because they want to, not because they feel they're forced to. And training makes employees feel valued. This is something we've found very much with people on the shop floor. If you get a project, a health and safety project that's based on behavioural safety principles, clearly it's the people on the shop floor are now the focus of the training, rather than the managers or the execs and the seniors in the organisation. And it's training that values them and helps them to feel valued. So in itself, it's a very motivating experience for them. This is the model. I mean, I give this as an example, but it's the principles behind it, I think, are of interest. This is a model that we use in talking about risk maturity. The point we would make here is that within an organization, traditionally, the health and safety approach has really only taken care of the first 3 levels here. So people come into the organization uninitiated, and they go through a period where they learn how to do a risk analysis, and they learn about the processes that are going on as established in that organization. They understand their way around it, and they get to the point where they're very familiar with all of that, and they're very compliant, and they're operating it to the best of their ability. That's the best you can hope, I think, from that level. What we're adding in here are 2 other levels that we're going to be talking about. It's about being insightful, having self-awareness, being able to manage your own impulses, if they're the kind of impulses that are going to be counterproductive in a health and safety context, and moving on to a point where people's experience and their knowledge, their domain knowledge really of the particular processes that are going on in their particular industry are all taken into account. So these people then, you are hoping, some will reach a level where they are permitted to make discretionary judgments or are consulted when the unexpected occurs, as it inevitably does. And so you're building in then a new level then of self-awareness and mutual respect, which then begins to feed backwards through those other levels as well. So it's not replacing anything in a way, it's just beginning to add something which then has the ability to permeate back through the organization and begin to influence how the other things have that are well established, but in the way in which they're done. So we're talking about then at the bottom of that graphic, self-knowledge and development, open communication and culture, mutual respect and trust. So that all leads to greater job satisfaction and engagement, and it allows people to take personal responsibility and ownership. I mean, it's about having people feel that they're as much a part of it as the management is a part of it. Or not doing exactly the same role, obviously, but something along those lines. Now, I have to say at this point, I'm afraid that my colleague and co-presenter, Nikki, has not been able to join us today, and she was going to talk to you specifically about one particular project in the mining industry, which follow along these very similar lines. I'm going to talk a bit more generally, because my experience is not of that particular industry, but heavy industry, yes, and oil and gas and so on. So I want to talk to you about the framework that we have used. I mean, it's a way of just getting things rolling within an organization. The point about culture change, or changing the climate and the culture within an organization so that things are viewed in a different way, is that it's very challenging. It seems to have been something which the regulators have turned to kind of in a last resort, because lots of the things that have been happening, particularly in the finance industry, not so much in the health and safety side of it, but similar sort of parallel processes, they found things that have not actually still managed to change the culture. And the culture is then, I think, seen as the new solution. And I think there's some value in that. But the point about it is you can't just change the culture. Culture is something that grows up over time. There's a legacy of culture. There's an inertia in a way, which is often a good thing because it keeps things on an even keel through turbulent times. But if you want to change the culture, it's not a quick fix. It does take a lot of graft. It's more like tilling a field, if you like, than just pressing a button. And there's some hard work has to go in. So in our view, in culture, there's a lot of mystique about culture, but one of the things you can say about culture is there's no people, there's no culture. And Ben Schneider has made the suggestion that the people make the place. So no people, no culture. And without changing the people, no culture change either, I guess. So that's just the background. I mean, the process that we use then is it falls into these phases. So we were working, first of all, with the people at the coal face, as it were, increasing self-awareness. We're then moving that on to a phase which is about group coaching, which may be based on shifts or groups within the organization, however it happens to be structured. And then that group culture moves on to team development. Okay, so as we're starting at the beginning, the point is that to change people, you have to attend to the personality issues. And I just want to clarify a few points about that in case that sounds too mysterious and mystical. It's more like engineering actually than you would think, perhaps. Modern perceptions within psychology of what personality is about and how it works. And I must say it's reached a point of being very effective and has a high utility. So the first point to make is behavior isn't rigidly choreographed by personality. Clearly everybody has free will. And it's both sides of that you're having to deal with within health and safety contexts. What are the predispositions of the people, and what is it that they are wanting to do, or what are the ways they're wanting to do things? So personality is about then fundamental dispositions. And those fundamental dispositions are very deeply rooted. And that means that whatever else is going on in the world, and there always will be plenty of things going on in the world that influence what you do, those dispositions nevertheless exert a persistent and pervasive influence. So if you want to change people's risk behavior, you've got to pay attention to those pervasive and persistent influences. So we each have, in effect, because of our personality, we each have a particular risk bias. The tendency in the past has been to view risk-taking as being something you either do or you don't, or it's on a linear scale at least. You may be at the bottom, in the middle, or at the top of it. Now, that's proved not to be the case. The fact is that aspects of personality are actually marbled, as it were, with risk influences, risk factors. When people are in a risk situation, it's because there is a disposition that they have that isn't under control at that moment. And we'll say a bit more about that later. But this is how we would describe the influence of personality on behavior. And for our purposes, the way we would describe risk personality, if you like, in relation to health and safety. So the point about the personality or the risk personality is there are aspects of it which are stable and relatively fixed. And those aspects of personality are not obvious. I mean, when you're perhaps putting a team together for a particular project, it's not going to be obvious what their personality is. It's only when you get to know people that you see what their dispositions actually are. So in this analogy then, in the graphic on the screen at the moment, we would say that risk behavior becomes apparent over time. The point about personality assessment is that you can cut to the chase very quickly, because you can identify 4 people in which they will find very illuminating and constructive, incidentally, what their risk dispositions actually are. So there's been this long-established association between risk-taking and personality. Every study of personality at some point will probably mention something about risk-taking, and every analysis of risk-taking will probably at some times mention personality. And the relationships in statistical terms are very strong. There are very strong correlations. We've known that for a long time. The problem is thinking, what is that relationship, though? So it's been viewed as being risk-taking as being perhaps another personality variable, a separate personality variable that's correlating with personality. There are reasons why that would happen because of the way we have defined risk, which has tended to be very simplistic. The realization now is that relationship between personality and risk-taking is fundamental aspect of the personality, is riddled with influences which in certain circumstances will create a safety hazard, if you like. So how people differ in risk orientation is really very striking. And we have data now from over 8,000, well, more than that, 10,000 completions of an assessment, which we describe as the Risk Type Compass Questionnaire. And that has been a very interesting experience. See, the point is there are two different brain functions involved with your emotions and your emotional reaction to life and to situations, and to your that manage your analytic, if you like, perspective on the world. But we all are somewhere on a scale between what we describe as being intense and composed. That's the emotional dimension. People who are intense are very anxious. They're very fearful about events. They're very cautious in what they do. They're very pessimistic about outcomes. And at the other end of that same dimension, people are very relaxed, confident, sure of themselves. They don't see the risk until maybe much later in the day. And that enables them to keep an open mind. And if it's something that is potentially an asset or a benefit that is involved in it, then they may hang on long enough to see the asset, whereas at the other end of the scale, people see only the risk. On the other scale, the analytic scale, the people at our prudent end, these are people who like to know exactly what they're doing and where they're going, and to have everything very carefully planned and organized. They don't like to go into anything blind, as it were. So they are therefore very well prepared for everything that they do, and very systematic and organized. At the other end, people who are carefree are people who are possibly very interesting. I mean, they'll be much more creative, they'll be more spontaneous, they'll be more impulsive, and they are the reverse of the prudent. But they're the innovators. They're the people who see opportunity and are prepared to go for it. So I think you can see these, in many ways, these different aspects of personality are very complementary. What you need, though, with our model is to introduce some intermediate risk types, because you can be both intense, for example, and prudent at the top of your screen. And that means if you were high on both of those scales, you would be one of our wary types. And so wary types are people who bring the passion of their intensity into the organization and the prudence and systems approach to things. So they are people who really want to take control. They want to take control for themselves and for the people around them. They really believe that you can eliminate all risk if you're careful enough and systematic enough and passionate enough about it. At the bottom of the screen, you have the reverse. You've got people there who are both high on composed and high on carefree. So now I think you'll see you've got people who are very calm, imperturbable, very easy, difficult to arouse any emotion from them. And at the same time, they have the characteristics of the carefree type, which is very spontaneous, impulsive, and really excitement-seeking. And those two together make an adventurous type who are absolutely intrepid, always calm, deal with everything that comes their way. You possibly know examples of either of those extremes. A similar sort of thing happens with the other two risk types, excitable and deliberate, because they're both a mixture of the primary scales, if you like, on either side of them. The model then looks like this. If you're assessed with the risk type compass, and this is what we would use with people on the shop floor, we can say, feed back this information to them about what particular risk type they are. And every one of those risk types has its benefits and its disadvantages. It has its sensitivities and its blind spots. Like any other aspect of personality. There's no personality which is good and another one bad. They all have their benefits. They all have their disadvantages. If that hadn't been the case, then they wouldn't have been so successful or so much a part of our survival for them to have been retained. So that's basically the way that we would differentiate people. When we're doing our individual feedbacks, when we're helping people to understand themselves, we're helping them to understand what it is about their risk type which is an issue in a health and safety context. And that's something they need to know if they're going to take responsibility for managing themselves. The interesting thing is that if you look at a large sample of people, I think this particular sample is something over 4,000 people from a wide range of sectors, industry sectors. And as you can see, there's very near equivalence of distribution around the risk types. So you're as likely to be one as you are another. The probability is fairly even. And this is why we call it Team Homo sapiens, because what our argument would be that societies need all of these people. They do need people who are cautious and careful. They do need people who are more intrepid and adventurous and original. And they do need people of all of these risk types. So this is then the model. Phase one, then, we would go through all of that and help people to understand that. And that's a very positive experience. We find we have ways in which we engage people. A lot of the people on the shop floor are not accustomed to being in an open, frank discussion and wanting to contribute. So they have to be relatively small groups, but it's a very interesting process, and the feedback we get from that is extremely positive from them. And they are the focus of attention for once, and people are listening to them and their concerns. The second level, though, is about group coaching. So this is stage two. In group coaching, what we do is we try to get people together of a similar risk type. It's not always easy because of shift patterns and so on, but that's the aim, and we would certainly try to get them as close as possible. The idea here is that people are going to share and discuss what it means being that risk type with each other. So we create a forum, if you like. I mean, the unfortunate analogy I'm about to make is like with Alcoholics Anonymous. You know, it's about getting people together to have the same, in that case, problems. In our case, though, of course, the risk types all have benefits too. So they can share both sides of that with each other. And that legitimizes it. It gives it credence. It gives it respect, if you like. And it helps people then to understand that their personal dispositions are not just them. Other people have exactly the same issues. And we're looking there at how those personality characteristics have benefits throughout their lives, not just in their work, in their relationships, in their formative years and so on, and what have been the challenges. And that gives mutual support to them and gives them, as it were, some status. So let's just examine a couple of examples, maybe, if we've got the time, to consider one or two of the risk types. Let's just look at the deliberate risk type. This should bring it home, I hope. So what are the characteristics of the deliberate type? Well, as I've said to you, they are going to be detail-oriented. Because they're detail-oriented, they may miss the big picture sometimes. They're calm and methodical, and so they may appear unfeeling and unresponsive in some situations to others. You know, the people who are more emotional, the deliberate type, will seem very calm, methodical, and they may seem uninterested in people issues. But that's not actually necessarily the case. There's other aspects of personality to take care of that. So they will be cautious in their approach, and so they might miss opportunities to innovate. And as you know, it depends on what the world that you're working in, but some things, the technology is fast moving. If you don't move quick enough, then you lose out, and it will change your position in the hierarchy. So there's a potential also for being overconfident. So they may feel regulations don't apply to them. They may come across sometimes as rather arrogant. I'm talking here about extreme types, because not every deliberate type will be extreme. There are obviously gradations of that, but these are the kinds of influences at work. What are the workplace behavioral implications then? Well, the calm, cautious, cool-headed but overconfident issue will be one of them. And although not being afraid of risk, they work to eliminate uncertainty through careful planning, attention to detail, and by considering the options with care. So you're teaching people to manage their dispositions, to be aware of them, so that when they go into certain situations, they know that this is something where their dispositions are not going to help them. And in others, they're going to be an advantage. The role that I would exemplify as the deliberate risk type we found fairly recently is flight traffic controller. flight traffic controllers, in a study that we did recently of 100 flight traffic controllers, something like 88 of them were deliberate risk types, which was quite an extraordinary finding. And they were, most of them, deliberate, were strong examples of a deliberate risk type. So that kind of characterizes a little bit what they would be and how that would influence their work. The wary risk type. Now, the wary risk type, you remember, these are the people who have two reasons for being risk averse. So they may miss opportunities to innovate and improve their approach. They're kind of, because of their emotionality, easily irritated. And they experience very strong feelings. So if they're frustrated, you know it. It's usually very evident with the wary type what they are going through emotionally at any one moment. They react in that kind of a way. It can mean they seem inflexible and resistant to change. I would think the truth is they're reluctant to change because they don't know if they're going into something new. They can't actually do their risk analysis, which they're doing all the time and over everything. So they're worried, anxious, and because of that, they're prone to stress. And they can be frustrated. They can be prone to overreact and to panic because they may lose their nerve in certain situations that they're having to deal with. So not always the best person to have around in a time of a crisis. Workplace behavioural implications then. In a way, their caution, vigilance and pessimism can be an advantage. They need to, enhancing their security is always high on their agenda. I mean, they want to eliminate risk if they possibly can at every possible opportunity. So such people have a need for certainty and like to know precisely what they can expect. So in managing them, these are things that they need to be aware of. You can see probably in a direct health and safety sense, these people are absolutely on the case because they're doing it all the time. They're not naturally emotionally resilient though, and they will find the stress of work gets to them at times. So the kinds of issues that you would get then, the extreme wary types, are more likely to do with stress and about maybe attendance and absenteeism sometimes. Okay. So that's just trying to give you some insights then into what happens at phase 1 and phase 2. The phase 3 development is really about what can we do as a team? How can you develop a team? And this is very interesting as well. I mean, for the practitioner who's taking people through these exercises, there's very wide acceptance of them. And because the risk types are very plausible and very easily understood, the reaction you get to those is nearly always positive. There are obviously going to be occasions when people disagree with their risk type. By and large, though, it's the opposite reaction. A reaction from the head of safety in a big organization recently, who said that's scarily accurate was the description they gave. So anyway, so what we're trying to do in a team situation is to see how the risk types around the table will influence what goes on. So it's about appreciating the benefits of being different, if you like, understanding other people's disposition. If you've got two people in a team who have a very different risk type, then there's possibly a cause for tension there because they see things very differently. We're trying to encourage people to be receptive then to the wide range of views on the way things should be done and ought to be done. You want people to actively seek contrary contributions. So if you have a group of people who are largely quite risk-taking, then you hope, if they have someone in the group who is less so, that they will seek their contribution as a sensible precaution before taking things further. And if you get that kind of mutual self-respect, this will happen. You encourage openness and transparency in the team, and that resists groupthink. The last thing you want in a team where people are diverse is that they are all actually thinking the same. That diversity somewhere along the line is going to be to their advantage. And we need to be aware too of risk polarization. That refers to the fact that if you've got a lot of high risk takers together, then that goes off the scale. I mean, they kind of wind each other up to be more and more risk taking. But the same is true at the other end. If you had a team that was all wary types, they'd be forever pointing out the more detailed minutiae of risk that was in the environment. So team development then is about getting the best out of everybody. It's back to the reference I made earlier on to Team Homo sapiens. Working together and we are more effective than if we're fighting each other. These are the kind of graphics that we would bring to the group situation. I mean, the first top left is the scattering of the group around the risk type compass. That's of interest because you want to see where people are grouped, whether there are factions, whether there are people in opposing viewpoint, and how many of them are there, and what's missing is important. What is it that in the whole spectrum of risk taking you haven't got in your particular team? And is that a worry or not, or do you need to compensate for it? It depends, obviously, what the task is for the team. The second picture at the top is distilling, if you like, the influence of risk types. So you can see in that one, there's the same group, but if you look at it through this lens, you can see that the adventurous type have overall a very strong influence over that team. It may be because in the first graphic, some of those dots will be more than one person. There are discrete places on markers are underpinning that graphic. So you will get occasionally people who are two of an exact same type, although there's more to be said about that as well. The third picture, bottom left, shows you what the average for the group is. So it's another window on the group. It's another point for discussion. To what extent does that really characterize us in reality? From what we know from our day-to-day experience of each other. So in this process, you're not trying to impose the psychometrics on them. You're just trying to use the psychometrics to raise topics and issues and to get people to discuss their experience against that kind of background and with that anchor to the discussion. A bit of objective data in amongst all the other opinions. And the last of those shows you the overall, that graph there, or that scale there, is something we call the risk tolerance index, and it's an overall estimate of appetite for risk for the individual. So in that graphic, you would see where the group is clustered, if there are separate clusters, how spaced out they are. Okay, so what we're trying to do then is move people away from just blind obedience. Obviously, obedience is not a bad thing, but if you're not thinking for yourself at all, if you're doing the minimum, if you're just going through the motions and somebody else is always pulling the strings, you're not probably getting the best out of that person. And even if you may be already getting the best, you're probably not getting it with any degree of enthusiasm. So it may not be affecting the incidents of the safety incidents on the site, but it may be affecting the bottom line because no one's in a great rush to do anything when they're being driven in that sort of a way. So it's not about overcoming human nature. It's about working with it. It's about seeing its benefits and advantages, and being aware of it and managing it, and being able to allow people, to enable them to manage their own dispositions. So what we now then is we're focusing on the individualistic challenge faced by different employees, and we make it personally relevant so that they become accountable for their own behavior. They're able to become accountable. You know, telling people that they must take responsibility doesn't go far enough unless you can tell them what it is they're taking responsibility for in terms of the challenges they face in delivering on that expectation. So just go back over that then, very briefly then, start with increased self-awareness. This is, as I referred earlier on to, changing the culture in organizations, a bit like tilling a field. You've got to get down to the nitty-gritty and you've got to work at it. And you have to start with people and their self-awareness. You have to move that forward to have group coaching sessions which reinforce that initial understanding and validate it, because they can talk to other people and share views and learn more from that of how it influences people. And thirdly, team development phase, where you're helping teams to work more effectively together through knowledge of each other's risk type, so that opposing risk types are not always pulling in the opposite direction and getting on each other's nerves. Now they can understand it and they can work together better. And all of those influences feed back down through the system. So phase 3 feeds back into phase 2, feeds back into phase 1 within the organization as the the project develops. Okay, so what are the benefits to the organization? Well, I mean, the number one benefit is obviously one in which you now hopefully will have a more outgoing, more positive, more enthusiastic, more committed workforce. But so the business outcomes are about developing a positive health and safety culture, about reducing accidents and ill health. I mean, in health that arises from disaffection with work, as well as from the stress that can be induced for some risk types, and contributing to quality management and complying with legal requirements. So we're not in any sense changing the rules about what is right and what is not right. It's the way we go about it that we're suggesting can be different, and which, broadly, there's an agreement and understanding that this is the case. Some of you may be doing some of these things or all of these things already. I don't know, but this is the point we're trying to make here. And for line managers, increased team commitment to the health and safety program, and help and involvement in developing those action plans. Improve communication with staff because it's now open. No one's hiding anything. People aren't any longer so concerned about how they appear. There's a recognition that people have a different agenda and a different challenge. And that's a lot better than just being told that you are a very bad person because you yet again broke that regulation. Better staff satisfaction, of course, and therefore better retention. And for the workers themselves, well, it's the dignity, I guess, and respect and the ability to influence the direction of health and safety management, to feel that their voice is heard, that they as an individual are being recognised, develop transferable skills in H&S, communication and negotiation, and to feel valued and to have a genuine stake in improving performance alongside everybody else. Okay, thank you very much for your attention. I'll hand you back to Jackie.
Okay, thank you very much, Geoff. We've had a number of questions come in, so we will go through some of those. So the first one, Geoff, is since female and males have very different behaviour, does it have a recognisable impact in safety matters?
That's a very interesting question. We have been doing some work in the flight industry, and I did mention flight traffic controllers, but now talking about pilots. What it appears to be the case is that in the health and safety situation, yes, women are more cautious. We haven't showed you the breakdown by gender of risk types, but there is a difference, and that's what you'd expect. So that females are more cautious, more long-term. There are all risk types are represented in both genders, but with different incidents. So yeah, there are implications for females, not as but really what the influence is risk type. I mean, you don't need to concentrate on the fact that, yes, there are differences in gender. I mean, the point is that whatever their risk type, those implications will be what the implications are. What you may expect, though, if you're recruiting an open recruitment policy and you have a lot of women working in an organisation, then you would expect them to be somewhat more compliant overall, but you will have people of all risk types there too.
Okay. We do not live in a perfect world, so we cannot eliminate all risks. Do you agree?
Yeah, absolutely. That's the problem, really. I mean, the issue is you can only regulate for risk and have a plan for how you're going to handle a risk if you know what that risk is. And as Mr. Rumsfeld has reminded us, there are the unknown unknowns. And there isn't any situation where that isn't the case. It may be an unknown of a very physical engineering kind in a heavy engineering situation where someone might get crushed, but it can also be an unknown in the sense that technological advances have been taking place rapidly, and you're rapidly getting out of date, so you're not using enough innovation in dealing with things, or that people are doing things quicker or better or smarter than you are. So there are all kinds of uncertainties in business, absolutely. And I think the zero aim is a very fine ideal. The problem with it, the zero risk incident ideal is great, but the problem is it's something no one's ever going to meet. So you can only be measured, as it were, negatively in relation to it. It's how badly you're doing that's the only possible conversation you can have, really. if the zero risk is the ideal, as you say, because I agree, it's not attainable.
Okay, what about the carrot and the stick approach to changing behaviour?
Yeah, I don't think it makes a difference to that, except that what you're doing is providing a lot more carrots. I mean, I think the danger with health and safety, and particularly as it's trying to drive that last bit of the journey and get rid of those residual accidents and incidents, the danger is you crank that up to such an extent that the stick is really operating big time and the carrot is almost diminished out of sight, you know. And this is, I say this from experience, and we talk to these people on a quite an intimate basis when you're working with teams like this. And they'll be very candid and honest to you. And you can see their disaffection at times. And the response when they think that their views are being taken into account. I mean, the danger for us always when you go into these situations is that you're seen as part of the management conspiracy. It's something else to get more out of us, to get more work, to get more profit, to have us working longer, whatever it happens they happen to be suspicious about. And of course, just by nature of their personality alone, there's going to be a proportion of people who generally think in that kind of a way. So there's a lot of reassuring to do before you turn the corner. The positive gains that you get out of that, once people are much more self-motivated, where people are working together instead of against each other, as it were. And the worst, I think, examples that we've come across is where health and safety really is a scam in order to put the blame on person at the time. You know, the managers, supervisors will quite happily walk past people who are doing things in a outside of the regulatory requirements and not say anything because they're very pleased they're getting the job done as quickly as they are. So they don't act at that point. But then when someone's injured or there's an incident, then, well, the question is, did you do it by the book? No, right, you're out. And that's really cynical. But it's the way things polarize if you're not careful, I think. It's not a desirable state of affairs. It's not a desirable state of affairs because you've got a workforce that is probably working at something like 50% of its actual capacity. If you could get them on the side and work with you, apart from anything else, as far as health and safety is concerned, you're going to have a much better bottom line.
Do you believe that the culture of the organisation is equivalent to the personality of the organisation? And if so, how hard is it to change?
I think it is hard to change. It's hard to change, as I said before, because it develops its own momentum. You know, the banking and finance industry used to hone their reputation by building enormous buildings in the city of London with beautiful Doric columns and making themselves look substantial. And that sort of got them through a long way, really, before it began to unravel when people weren't paying attention to it. But I think in a way, I understand what you mean. It would appear like the personality, I suppose, of the organisation. And in another sense, it's the nature of the really senior people, the top end, that tend to permeate the attitudes within the organisation. But I think health and safety cuts across that in a way. It brings in a whole nother discipline, which is not normal. I mean, to have a work in a situation which is so precise and specific about absolutely the way things should be done. Yes, indeed, they should be in terms of the outcomes, and that's what you want. But I think it's hard to change. I think that's the reason. I think the reason it's hard to change organisations is because there's a sort of inertia. People are used to doing things the way they do. You've got to turn that round. And it's only going to work if you actually strike the right nerve. And I think actually that's why the risk-type compass is a critical tool in all that, because it's something that awakens people to the realization of what is going on within themselves and gives them a very positive feel because the organization is doing something that focuses on them, not just on the bottom line and not just on the figures and not just on, productivity.
Okay. Will a team with more diversity of risk type work more effectively?
That's a good question. I think it can be true. I don't think there's an ideal, I think, in the UK here we come to the end of the soccer season and there's lots of recrimination going on about which football manager manage their team the best. You know, team building is a real skill in its own right, and I wouldn't be the one to say you need to have one of each person on every risk type represented. That isn't the case, but I think you do need diversity. You know, if you don't have diversity, it's just cloning one person. So when it comes to thinking for themselves or making decisions, then you've got a very limited resource on your hands. I mean, the ideal, I think, is that you have a diverse group. What that diversity actually amounts to in terms of which risk types it can be a challenge. And one of the reasons it can be a challenge, I think, is that people are not always attracted to that job of the kind that you might maybe prefer or like to be represented there. But yeah, I think diversity genuinely is a good thing. It gives you more to play with, so long as it's dealt with correctly or well, dealt with well, and I think openly and establishing mutual respect. I think that becomes the challenge then.
Have you had any pushback from shop floor workers in taking the risk type compass assessment?
Yeah, I think any assessment is somewhat daunting if you're not familiar with the process. And I think very often shop floor workers are not used to things like personality questionnaires and ability tests and that sort of thing. So in that context, yes, I think you do get some pushback. The answer to that, I think, is that you work from the top down. We will, if we were doing a project of this kind within an organization, we would want to work with the board. We would want them, because we want them to know what we're doing. I mean, the chances of seeing this through to actually reap the benefits is that you don't have the support from the top. And I'm not into going into organizations where I'm set up to fail. You want to succeed. And in order to do that, you really do need to have the board involved. It's a benefit to the board. The board need to know what the risk types around the table are, because they'll face those same issues about the dynamics of the group and irritating each other and always feeling, why are you always on my case? Whenever I say this, you say that, kind of situations. And as you know, egos in the boardroom tend to be pretty massive. So, and it's a volatile situation. So yeah, I think doing it themselves is very good, and it diffuses some of that, and it's constructive, and that's the feedback they give us. And then the senior execs and so on. So I think working down through the organization is very positive. And we were at a meeting just recently after beginning a new project in a metal smelting sort of industry, and it was the senior people who were saying, well, why don't we tell these guys that what risk type we are? Why don't we be open about it? And I thought it was a great suggestion. Now, I did a talk last year in San Diego, actually, at the American Psychological Association on this sort of stuff, and we all wore the T-shirt with the risk type on. I'm not suggesting that one does that, but it's the kind of thing, it's the kind of openness that you want, and that's overcomes the problem of getting people to take the questionnaire. If you can say, well, we've taken it and we think it's great, and we think you'll find it interesting, and it's done in that kind of a way, then you're fine. And really, we haven't had a lot of difficulty.
Okay, one final question. Does age have an impact on risk type?
Yes, it does. I mean, it has an impact because personality has an impact. Age has an impact on personality. And because risk type is personality based, then there is a trajectory through life which takes you in certain directions. People who are most anxious, for example, we talked a little about the wary type, but the intense type in particular. Life can be a struggle sometimes for them because they are so anxious about things. But as they get older, they get a little bit more mellow, a bit more comfortable in their skin, and they ease back a bit on the pressure they put on themselves, which is what's actually happening. So yes, there's the other direction as well. I mean, people become more flexible and more easy, usually as they get older. They also, though, on the other hand, get fearful of particularly physical perils. So climbing stairs and so on as they get really elderly. But, over a working life, it stays extraordinarily consistent. And it begins to level off at the maturity of the brain, which is like late teens, early adulthood. And from then on, it is remarkably consistent. I mean, that's not just my opinion. That's really global research. and across cultures, people are pretty stable. I mean, we're not saying it's unmovable. You know, if you put people through a massively traumatic incident, or if people are facing very difficult time in their lives, then other things come to the fore for their own survival, probably, to help them get over it. So personality isn't totally inflexible, but those dispositions are really there, and they do have a persistent influence on you.
Okay, that's great. And thank you everyone for your questions. For those that we didn't get to go through, we will respond to you directly as we've now come to the end of the webinar and run out of time. So thank you very much, Geoff. I mentioned at the beginning that we would be recording, that we have recorded this webinar, so we will circulate a link via email for you to watch that. If you have any questions, please do contact us. Here's our contact details, so you can email us or get in touch over the phone or indeed MHS. And all that's left to say is thank you very much for attending the webinar.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.